Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending our IRA forum. The purpose of the forum is to answer any questions you have with the new laws that are going into place. And I'm excited to have Jeff Supple, our own Jeff Supple, do the presentation for us today. I think you'll find he's very knowledgeable and very approachable even during the meeting and if you have questions later. Jeff works here at the bank in our wealth management area. He's a certified financial planner and a trust officer for the bank and has been for many years. His main role is he works with people, individuals mostly, doing financial planning and then helping them prepare for retirement. And then of course, helping them as they go through retirement. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lois. I appreciate all the attendees. It's neat seeing the numbers build up here. Like I had mentioned before, I'm not sure how long this will take. We wanted to do something that was somewhat timely, obviously timing everything with the elections, and obviously there's some still uncertainty on that end, but we talk about a little bit of that too. But in addition to COVID and all the legislation that's come out with that, and many of you are aware of the changes in in particular, the required minimum distribution waiver, but there was legislation passed at the end of last year that have quite a bit of impact on IRA accounts. So what we're going to go through today is get the agenda pulled up here, go through the Secure Act, which was passed at the end of 2019. Then we'll talk about the CARES Act, which was passed at the end of March of this year. And then talk about spend some time on the IRA waiver this year. And then also post-election planning, what we see as far as potential tax law changes, estate tax changes, what's in the Biden plan right now. And, a lot of that hangs on these runoff elections coming up on January 5th in Georgia, but we can talk a little bit about that too. And then obviously when we're done, we'll open it up to questions and take it from there. So the first one is the Secure Act. It stands for Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement. And really the idea, there was a lot of legislation here. The main goal of this legislation was to make retirement plans more accessible to more people, and particular individuals that work for small businesses. So there's a lot of tax credits for employers setting up 401k plans, for example, where they didn't have it available before, and automatic enrollments. This has been something that's been pushed by Congress for many years, realizing that we have a real problem with people saving enough for their retirement. So they're doing everything they can to make that available. You'll see here, this had bipartisan support. 417-3 was the vote on it, which is nice to see, something that we can all agree on in this day and age. And it was revenue neutral, which basically means there was no taxpayer dollars that were shelled out to fund this legislation. Now, what they had to do is raise some revenue. And the biggest way that they decided that they're going to raise revenue to pay for this is change how beneficiaries, non-spouse beneficiaries of IRAs treat their distribution. So prior to 2019, at the end of 2019, if you inherited an IRA from mom or dad or your grandparents, you were able to stretch, many of you have heard that term, stretch those distributions over your lifetime. What this legislation says is we're getting rid of that entirely. So after 1/1 of 2020, if somebody passes away and you inherit an IRA and you're a non-spouse of that individual, you have to take the entirety of that IRA in distributions in 10 years. It's 12/31 of the 10th year anniversary of death, to be exact. They don't care how you take it. So they don't have a required minimum distribution each year that has to come out. It's just that by that 10th year anniversary, or the end of the year, the 10th year anniversary, that entire IRA has to be out of there. Now, one thing that we've been doing with individuals, obviously this is new, but we've been talking to individuals that have inherited IRAs since the beginning of this year, is really taking a look at this from a planning standpoint of, if we got 10 years and it's a $50,000 IRA, for example, I probably don't want to add $50,000 of income on that last year. Maybe I want to spread out that tax liability. I had a conversation yesterday with an individual on this very topic, and she said, well, I'm going to be in a different tax bracket in 10 years, so I'm going to wait and take it all out then. So this is a big change. And again, the reason that this generates revenue is because the IRS gets that money sooner than they normally would have. There are a couple of exceptions to this rule. So if you are a non-spouse beneficiary and you're less than 10 years younger, then you can still go off of the old rules. So think of siblings, for example. So if you have a sibling that's 5 years younger than you, they can continue to stretch out the distributions over that period of time. The other big piece of this was the new required minimum distribution age, which for years was 70 and a half. And they changed that to 72. This was a compromise. One side wanted it pushed to 75. The other side said, hey, we'll let you get rid of this stretch IRA, but we don't want to have that distribution age pushed to 75. So they settled on 72. So those are the new required minimum distributions age. The part of that a lot of people had questions on was how did that affect qualified charitable distributions, which I know many of you have either heard of that or have taken advantage of that. And that's a qualified charitable distribution is instead of taking your required distribution out and then your IRA provider sends it to your bank account or sends you a check, they make a payment directly to a nonprofit. Church is very popular. A lot of people are doing it to their church. And the thought process behind that is then that doesn't get added on to your taxable income, and it certainly benefits the nonprofit organization. The plan with this legislation is they didn't want to hurt nonprofit organizations by passing this, so they kept the 70 and a half rule for the qualified charitable distributions. One thing I will note, make sure you note, is you actually have to turn 70 and a half, the actual date, in order to make a qualified charitable distribution in that given year. So. And again, we can talk more about that later, questions you have down the road. Let's see. So the next piece was, this was all pre-coronavirus. So coronavirus hit and we needed a relief package, and it came through in the CARES Act, which is a Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security is what that stands for. And in that, you had everything from the stimulus checks that some of you may or may not have received, retirement plan distribution relief, which I'll talk about a little bit, and then the PPP, which is the Payroll Protection Program. PPP loans were in there. But for purposes of our discussion, the big piece of that probably affected many of you on this call is the waiver of the 2020 required minimum distribution. What happened is this was passed at the end of March. There were a number of people that already took their distribution, and they didn't come out with language until later in the year that said, okay, if you took it out, you can put it back in by August 31st and they treat that as a rollover or non-taxable distribution. So you could get it back in there. Why I thought was important to talk about today is because a lot of people and a lot of our clients that take their required minimum distributions, take them in December. They like to use it for Christmas gifts and gifts to the children. So if you took it out early December, you actually technically have 60 days to put it back in if you want to. So you do have a little bit of wiggle room there. The question I'm getting now is, well, what about 2021? That I don't know. So, obviously the Congress is working on a second relief package, and whether or not that includes the waiver of the required minimum distribution, it's tough to say right now. I was reading that, the Republican bill and did not have the stimulus checks, I believe. So I have no idea if they're going to continue to do the waiver in 2021. From a planning standpoint, maybe it's best if you don't need the money and you normally take the distributions out at the beginning of the year in January. Maybe you hold off on that just to wait and see. But we just don't know at this point in time. The coronavirus related distributions probably not affected a lot. This had more to do with people that were in 401k plans, but it did affect IRAs a little bit as well too, which basically said if you were under 59 and a half, you could take out distributions from your IRA and not get hit with the 10% penalty if it was considered a coronavirus related distribution, which would basically mean that if you or your spouse were affected or diagnosed with coronavirus, then you could take the money out and not get penalized on it, but it's still subject to tax. But the tax could be spread out over a 3-year period. So again, I didn't have. I don't think one of our clients took advantage of this. So I don't see that widespread, but it's worth noting because it was in the act. But again, we can have questions on that later if you want me to clarify a little bit more. So the big question leading up to the election, and we thought we would have some more answers after the election. Now, obviously, probably more questions, but what's going to happen here? What's going to happen to taxes? What's going to happen to the estate tax? The only thing that we can really go off of is what's in Biden's original plan. And I reread through that this past weekend just to get a little bit of better understanding. But a lot of it hangs in the balance of what's going to happen with the runoff election. So right now, it stands the Senate is 50-48 with Republican and Democrat. So if the Democrats win both the Georgia runoff elections, then that's going to be 50-50, and then that tie is broken by the vice president. So the Democrats will technically have a majority. Now, we had an economist speak to us a few weeks ago, and he said even with that, you probably don't get a lot done as far as sweeping legislation. So just because the Democrats are going to be in control of both the presidency, the House, and the Senate doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be able to get everything done that they want to. But I think it's worth noting what are some things out there that they're looking to change. Number one would probably be the corporate tax rate. That's down at 21 right now. That was down from 35, so that was cut significantly with the tax cuts at the end of 2017. They're looking to bump that up to 28. So, think about what that would impact, and potentially impact some stock market earnings and stock market performance. But we're not certain yet what that number is going to land at. Next part of it is the estate tax. That's always been a hot button issue with Republicans and Democrats, and you can debate that all you want, but right now the estate tax exemption is 11.58 million. And if you're married, you can basically double that. And that was part of being doubled in the tax cuts back at the end of 2017. Now, those are set to expire in 2025, but we don't think they're going to make it that long. So that's something that's definitely probably going to be on the table, is taking a look at reducing that estate tax exemption. So basically what that means is if you have more than $11.58 million, that's subject to the estate tax. And they're probably looking to roll that back to Bush era levels, which would be about 3.5 million. So again, from a planning standpoint, we just don't know. A lot of people are talking to their estate planning attorneys. Do we need to readjust our plan now or wait to see what happens? So those are, if you have a trust in place, that's something that you want to ask your estate planning attorney. Does anything need to be done now in anticipation, or should we wait and see? Sometimes people like to get it done prior to something happen, because a lot of times what they end up doing is they make everything retroactive. So even if they don't get anything passed until late 2021, they'll make it retroactive to the beginning of the year. The other thing that the Biden plan has is an increase in the estate tax amount up to 45%. So anything that's subject to the estate tax would be taxed at a 45% rate. The big one here is the step up in basis. So if you bought a stock, for example, for $10,000 and years later it's worth $50,000, when you pass away, the individual that inherits that stock, if they go around and sell it, they don't have to pay the gain of that 10,000 to 50,000. They don't have to pay tax on that gain. They get what's called a step up in basis. So their basis in that stock is now 50,000. So if they sell it out right away, nothing gets taxed. The Biden plan really is focusing in on removing that. But as it stands right now, only for people with incomes over $400,000. So that's kind of the theme, is $400,000 is that term that's been thrown out there quite a bit, that level right now. So any tax increases in the federal tax rate wouldn't be affected by anybody making under $400,000. So interest rate outlook, what we see going into next year, probably nothing. I don't see interest rates moving probably until at least 2022, maybe not even out until 2023. So I always, the demographic I'm talking to today will understand this, is you got squeezed on both ends. When you're borrowers back in maybe the late 70s, early 80s, interest rates were, a lot of people, I've heard stories of people, paying 12, 13% on a mortgage. Now you're turning around in your savers and interest rates are near rock bottom. It's really fortunate right now if you're a saver. If you're a borrower right now, these low interest rates, our mortgage lenders have just been going crazy because everybody's refinancing and getting some real relief on their mortgage payments, and getting down to 2.5% in some cases, 2.75. So it's been fantastic there. But for the borrowers that want to invest in risk-free assets such as CDs, rates have completely bottomed out, and we don't see those changing much. The last thing the Fed wants to do is raise rates. So the Federal Reserve has a couple of mandates, and full employment and stable prices, which means that they want to combat inflation as much as possible, and they want people obviously to be employed and have a very low unemployment rate. Well, if interest rates are low for a long period of time, and during a lot of times you see inflation kind of, if you have cheap money out there, you see inflation rear its ugly head. Well, we haven't had inflation, and it doesn't look like we're going to have it. So raising rates probably is not in the cards for a little while yet, anyway. From the investment standpoint, I don't want to get too specific on individual types of holdings, but if you look at a situation where income tax rates are going to be a little bit higher, than tax-free investments such as municipal bonds start to look a little bit more attractive. We think as a group internally that U.S. companies are going to be doing better than international going into next year, with the exception of there's some opportunities maybe in the emerging markets, and specifically emerging market countries that don't have a lot of exports to the U.S. right now, and think Russia and China there. The idea that, with a Biden presidency, maybe some of those trade restrictions are going to lessen, and that tariff war is going to be over. We just don't know, but those are areas of focus that we're looking at. And then, as always, non-highly correlated assets should be added to portfolios. So a little bit commodities, not specifically gold, real estate, but we're a little wary of real estate right now, specifically commercial real estate, given everything going on with coronavirus and what's going to happen on the tail end of that, and what's that mean for office space and all of those things shaking out. So, but yeah, that's our, I guess, quick view on the legislation that's out there, what we see potentially for some changes in the tax code, and what's going to happen with this new administration. I think there's a lot of positives in the economy. Obviously, there are certain sectors that have just been decimated, but manufacturing, and we look at our commercial clients that are manufacturing clients on the commercial end that are thriving. So there's some good news out there, but it's hard to find. It's hard to find, especially if you watch the news. I mean, it's a little difficult given a global pandemic situation. But yeah, I hope everybody's healthy and families are healthy. And I guess I'll open it up to questions right now, Lois.
Okay, if anybody has a question and they would like to send it in the chat, that would be great. It's always hard to know if people are comfortable doing that. If I don't hear anything, I may just mute people and ask for that. Maybe that's what we'll do. Yeah. We'll unmute everyone, and that way, if you have a question, just know if you're speaking, your video or your name will appear on the video. But just remember, your video, this will only be shared with our group. So it's not like we're putting it out on the internet. Okay. So I just want to tell you that before I unmute everybody. Let's see if I can.
Yeah.
So what I actually did is I just gave you the option to unmute yourself. So if you go to the bottom left-hand corner, and if it has a red line through the microphone, if you touch it, you'll unmute yourself. Or if you touch on the top of an iPad or an iPhone, you'll be able to see the unmute button. So does anybody have any questions for Jeff?
Yes, Lois, this is Debbie.
Okay,
I've got
hi.
a question. Hi. Where you had said minimum required withdrawals from inherited 403s or retirement plans, that you have 10 years to take the money out. What about ones that started 10, 12 years ago? You
Those
get the
can-
minimum.
Yeah, it's a good question. So this only applies to inherited IRAs that are established after the first of the year this year. So they continue on the same schedule. If it was 12 years ago, then they can continue to take distributions out over their lifetime.
So anyone else? Must have answered all the questions, Jeff. All right. Well, if we don't have other questions, and again, feel free to reach out to Jeff or to myself, and we'll get you an answer to questions you have if something comes to you later, or if we can be of assistance. Jeff works out of our Wanakee and our Middleton office, and not Oregon so much anymore, right, Jeff?
Right, mainly Middleton and Wanakee.
Yeah, yeah. And he helps with financial planning and retirement planning. But we certainly want to be able to be a resource for you. And I guess with that, then we'll wrap it up and just thank everybody thank you for coming, and thank you, Jeff, for presenting to us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everybody
Thank
stay
you.
safe.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff.
Yep.